Today we have Chris Dantec. Chris is an assistant professor of digital media at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. Chris's research focuses on participatory design, on digital democracy, and smart cities. And he's worked extensively with the city of Atlanta to explore issues of digital civics. And he has a new book that just came out called Designing Publics. I just got my copy today. Thank you, Chris. And I actually know Chris from my time at Georgia Tech. We were both in the Human-Centered Computing program, PhD program, and I was actually leading when he came in, which is interesting that he's come so far. And in fact, he did such a good job.
Despite all early indications,
he came so much farther, so much faster than I did. What was interesting is he actually did such a great job there that they recruited him to stay on as a professor there, and he's been doing excellent work ever since. So, with that,
thanks. Thank you. So I've really enjoyed, I've been here for, I guess, a day and a half. I've met, I think, many of you over the last not quite 24 hours, or maybe it's been 24 hours. And really, the kinds of things that I'll be talking about today, I think we've heard some of them in the Design Lab meeting this afternoon. So if you were not there and you're confused about what a charrette is, turn to your neighbor and ask them to explain it to you. But today I'm going to talk about digital civics. And really, as Stephen pointed out, the way I think about digital civics is this kind of intersection between the kinds of activities that are going on around smart cities and the instrumentation of infrastructure and the instrumentation of people and the kinds of data that get produced through that instrumentation, and digital democracy, which is this kind of much longer running agenda around moving government services and kind of government interactions into online and asynchronous spaces. And by thinking about digital civics, what I'm looking at is not just the relationship between government and residents or citizens or denizens, and not just about the kinds of privileged moments of interaction like voting or showing up at public meetings, but really the kind of mundane relations that different community groups have to each other. Some of those are through official channels, and the case study that I'll talk about today kind of touches on some of those official channels, but is a much broader category of really how do we relate to each other in our communities, whether that's at the neighborhood scale, at the city scale, at the kind of metropolitan region scale, and then how do we take action within those relationships to kind of envision or imagine the cities that we would like to live in. So the first part of this talk is really about data and what constitutes data and the role of data within this realm of digital civics. And if we think about smart cities, data become a very important part of that story. So it's not just about the sensors that you create. In fact, the sensors are just a way to get to data. And those data then are generally the kind of rhetorics that get propped up with smart cities. It's about efficiency, right? It's about turning information into a force that can be used for decision making and operational efficiency, so that cities are able to better deal with whether it's constrained resources, aging infrastructure, issues of sustainability and environmental friendliness, right? That all of these are very operational kinds of concerns. And underneath all of this issue of data is important. And I was trying to think of how to show or think about data, and what I came up with, this is probably familiar to all of you. I went to Google Images and said San Diego beach, and this came up. And you might ask, why should I use a beach to talk about data? And it's not so much the beach that I'm interested in, but the sand. And with respect to smart cities, data are to smart cities what sand is to beaches, right? It's pervasive. It's the thing that has to be there. Like I guess it could be a beach without sand, but we'll not get too fine on that point. But also, like, once you get to it, right, you go to the beach and sand, if you're not careful, is everywhere, right? You leave with it in your shoes or in your bag, in your towel, and if you don't shake your towel out at the right place, it's now in your house, and then it's in your house, and it's everywhere in your house suddenly, right? And it's the same kind of thing with smart cities, is that data gets picked up and pulled into all sorts of different places. And when we think about, or when we listen to the kinds of ways that at least municipalities and some of the boosters of smart cities at that level talk about it, is that if you take all of this sand, all of these data, and you do it right, you build it up correctly, you can make an amazing city. Right? You can sculpt it, you can create this kind of utopic view of great customer service to your residents, really efficient processes and procedures. I mean, it's got everything, right? Multi-level pools, you've got a pumpkin carriage at the bottom. Really, like, this is this wonderful view of the smart city. The reality, of course, is much, much more complicated, or maybe much less complicated, and it looks more like this. Right, and so the smart city is really just a bunch of silos, right? It's these data silos that live kind of, proximate to each other. They're not really that well connected, and they're solving particular problems. But the thing that isn't always obvious is that they're always at risk of being washed away by a changing tide. Right? And so whether that changing tide is a new administration comes in and decides, well, all of our service contracts with providers are now going to be changed to a new set of providers, right? The way that I don't know how many of you work closely with cities, but at least in Atlanta, the majority of kind of operations are through contract-based negotiations with the city, so they're not done in-house. And so as services get built up, what ends up happening is that they become dependent on those contracts, and then that tide changes, and now you're starting from scratch again. The data might still be there, or they might be washed away with the tide, but the point is that it's much more uncertain and precarious than some of the ways that we might talk about data otherwise. The other part of this talk, and the other part of digital civics, is the question, or the concern with participation. And specifically how we are encountering civic participation. And traditionally it's through venues like this, these kinds of privileged moments in some sense, where you go to a public meeting in a venue that looks much like this. You might have a microphone where you get to stand up and view your opinion. And these are important, and they're not going away, but they're being augmented by the same kinds of technologies and the same kinds of computing, essentially, that's enabling data capture and the smart cities types of activities. Right? So instead of going to these synchronous moments where we're talking to each other, the kinds of civic participation that we have now is happening through things like Twitter. So this was a grab from earlier this year of Cory Booker's Twitter feed. Those of you may know Cory Booker now as a senator. When he was a mayor of Newark, he was one of the first kind of public officials to embrace Twitter as a way to directly communicate with his constituents. And so people would tweet at him pictures of potholes or things that were broken in the city and be like, hey, Mayor Booker, what's up? Fix this. And he would kind of jump the work queue and get that request in to fix a pothole or to adjust some broken infrastructure. And this is an interesting case study. And so through Twitter, people are able to kind of change the process through which they're submitting issues of infrastructure and kind of service provision in the city. And then those people that are actually able to get his attention on Twitter are the ones who are in fact having kind of more sway in getting the city to respond to their particular needs, rather than feeding into a larger kind of system where, first in, first out work order system, where if you call 311 and say, hey, something's broken, and there might be 50 things ahead of it that are broken before it gets to yours. But it's important because this takes us away from those rituals and gives us a way to think through alternate kinds of modes of participation that aren't just synchronous, right? And they aren't just about these kind of enshrined rituals of participation. The other thing that this kind of points to are the ways that not just technology as a mode of providing kind of rational support and decision making, but as a way to shift power structures and forms of influence. So just as people can say, oh, I'm going to jump the queue here and have Cory Booker reply to me and fix this pothole, other forms of civic media or kind of civic interfaces are changing these power structures. So this is a screen grab from the ACLU's app that is used to record police interactions. Right, and this came up directly as a result of kind of everything that we've learned through the Black Lives Matter movement and the way that minority groups have been treated by police and continue to be treated by police, and the visibility that now we can record and do this kind of counter surveillance, that visibility means that people are understanding the problem differently. And that's shifting. This is not about, oh, we can now make a decision about this, but it's shifting where the power and the influence is, so that groups that were formerly powerless now have an opportunity or a tool where they can start to shift that in a political way rather than in a kind of operational way. Right? And all of these are important parts of what I'm kind of broadly referring to as digital civics, where you have forms of data production, whether that's through instrumentation or through the kind of event-based recording. It's asynchronous kinds of interactions, which harken back to digital democracy types of things. It's personalized, right? So it's coming through things like social media. And so it's the kinds of interactions are being contextualized in your daily lives and your own kind of social networks. And largely it's on demand. So you can kind of choose when you want to do it and when you don't, turn it on, turn it off. All of the kinds of interactions that we're generally, I think, certainly as a Western and privileged part of Western society, getting used to in the form of interactions through our phone and social media. And so with this setting of data and participation as these two important pieces, there's kind of a case that I want to walk through with some research that I've been doing over the past few years with the city of Atlanta. And so what I want to really focus on here is this idea of data through participation to start with. And I'll come back and I'll flip this around to talk about participation through data. And let's see, what do I want to say about this before moving on? So specifically the case study that I want to talk about is an app called Cycle Atlanta. And this is a project that I started in 2012 with a colleague, Carrie Watkins. She's a faculty member in civil and environmental engineering, and she does work on transportation systems. So she cares about how people use public transit systems and about the way that you form alternate uses besides cars within dense urban centers. She did her work, her PhD work was at University of Washington, where she created One Bus Away with another student in computing there. And so really focused on these kinds of, crowdsourced and public-facing modes of providing information to help people make better choices or different choices about the transportation they use. In 2012, the city approached Carrie, and Carrie approached me. I'm the caboose on this train of importance, to say, well, we would like to produce an app that allows us to know where cyclists are in the city. And all of this stems from Living Cities Initiative. So these are a kind of a category of planning initiative that is kind of happening in lots of large cities in the US, say how do we make the urban core more livable in some sense, and livable in the kind of Florida creative class sense, right, where you have people that are connected to cultural centers and centers of economic growth and centers of residential life, so that people want to live there and they can move about freely. And a big part of that is having transportation systems that don't require you to spend hours and hours in your car. If you've ever visited Atlanta, you will know that Atlanta is a place where you spend hours and hours in your car. What the city wanted was two things. They wanted data about where cyclists were and where they were currently going. This is data that's traditionally hard to produce because doing cycle census taking means you have to send people out to specific locations in the city, kind of what you think are the key times of day, and you count the number of bikes that go by and which direction they're going. That's expensive. It also doesn't tell you anything about kind of the route that was chosen and where those decision factors might be. The other thing that the city wanted very clearly was to think of this as an experiment in broadening participation in the planning process. So normally when you do these kinds of plans, you might get tens of people to show up at the different public meetings over several months. So how could we create a kind of digital interaction that would enable more people to participate through the production and submission of data that would broaden, in some sense, give claim to a broader canvas in the way that the project progressed. So it's it's pretty straightforward as an app, right? You pull it out of your pocket. Nobody, please do this now because it's out of date and broken. This is the problem when you produce an app for research, is then you stop being a researcher and you become a software developer who has to maintain software. But the idea is you pull it out, you start your trip, you go on your ride, you hit save, you tell us a little bit about the trip, so what was it for? The majority of the people that use our app are doing it for commuting. People who are committed to fitness tend to use apps that better support fitness, although we did have some of those. We also have some facilities to record what we call notes, which are kind of acute places in the city where something most often is broken, but it might also be something good like a bike rack or a shortcut that isn't well known. And all of this kind of fits into this smart cities mode of data production, right? So instead of instrumenting the roads and trying to count the bikes that go by on the roads, we're instrumenting the cyclists and having them produce these data to tell us where they go. It's also because of this mandate to say create something and run this kind of experimental and experiment not in the kind of traditional sense, but in the hey, we're just going to try something sense mode of new participation. It's also about this mode of digital democracy, right? So it's about people starting to advocate for the things that they want by riding certain routes and knowing that that data is being submitted and to be used for public policy and kind of determining what's interesting and how to make these decisions. So this map was the map that started the project, and this was a map that was produced by the planning department in the regional planning office. And what it does is it really just identifies the red lines here are these core arteries that they're saying, hey, these are where we know if we build bike facilities along these roads, then these connect the kinds of things that we're interested in connecting in the city. The orange lines are also of interest, but slightly less high a priority. What you don't really get a sense of here is that many of these are not bike-friendly roads. They're multi-lane, they're fast traffic, yet they're still the ones that seemed the least worst option for the initial plan. And what's interesting, I think, is that one way to think about this is, oh, the city wants to know where to build new bike infrastructure. But if we step back and we look at the goals of the project, really what the city wants to do is build more cyclists. Right? They're trying to expand the number of people who are riding bikes, which means that the kinds of decisions that you make in here are really important because there are different kinds of people who ride bikes. And the kind of bike rider that they really don't want to support is this guy. Right? And the term of art here is a mammal. So mostly all men in Lycra. I just call this guy Bane on a bike. And like really, no matter what you do, this person is going to ride, right? They're very committed. They're clearly into it for fitness. They're going to ride no matter what the traffic situation is or the geography. Atlanta's a deceptively hilly town. And so building infrastructure that kind of traces or follows where riders of this type go isn't going to expand the number of people who choose cycling as a mode of transportation. Instead, we want to build facilities that support someone like this, who is not going to ride on busy roads because she's got 3 kids behind her on a ute bike. And I would point out that one thing that I find fascinating is that often the way some folks will talk about supporting cyclists is, oh, we want to support the more casual cyclists, and then they'll talk about someone like this. But like, this person is not a casual cyclist. They've got a ute bike and 3 kids on the back. She is a very dedicated cyclist. She just doesn't have the same, this kind of equipment. And so I think there's rationale here that it's not about how committed a person is as a cyclist or their kind of identity as a cyclist, but really the other things that are going on in their life, right? If you're picking up your kids, that's a totally different kind of set of constraints around your choice to ride a bike and kind of where you might go after you pick them up. And so part of the data that we collected tried to get at this question, right? How do we not just build bike facilities that connect where people are going, but how do we build bike facilities, or where do we build bike facilities that will broaden the number of people who choose to ride? So the map that we can produce with some of our data looks more like this. And I could flip back and forth between the two, but like basically the main routes that were on the other map were, one was down here, this was 10th Street, which is another one, and then there was another over here. And what the colors here show is that we have 4 different categories of writer. So we have strong and fearless, enthused and confident, comfortable but cautious, and interested but concerned. And it's really these last 2 that are the most interesting, right? Because most people are some version of comfortable but cautious or interested but concerned. It's like, yeah, I might ride, but I really don't want to ride in traffic, or I really don't want to ride up a big hill. And so those are the places where, as planners are looking at where to build new facilities, these are the kinds of things that help them understand, not just that, okay, we know that this is a busy intersection for cyclists, and it would have been that way before any of this was possible. But how people then move on through that intersection becomes much more interesting for the planners to understand than just the pure number of people going through that. The other thing that we can start to show through some of this, so if you've been to Atlanta, this is Piedmont Park. Georgia Tech is over here. This is a brand new greenway called the Beltline. And we launched the app just before that opened. It's a new project. And so we can kind of, we don't have a lot of use before it opened, but we have enough to kind of show, hey, when you build it, they do in fact come, right? That there was, in some sense, there's a latent demand for dedicated pedestrian and cycle facilities in Atlanta, and that it's not just, if we look at this and we kind of select based on this route, it's not just kind of the immediate surroundings that use it, it's all of Atlanta kind of gravitates toward it and then moves out through the city. So it's showing that there's real impact in some of the changing infrastructure that we have here. The thing that this map does, though, as well, is it starts to kind of materialize a cycling community. So for a diffuse community, this makes it look like, wow, they're everywhere. Right, and so this is a really naive rendering of the data where we just said, hey, here's all of our trips that have these selectors on them, let's just map them. It's not taking into account time of day or day of week or week of month, et cetera. And so we can look at that, but part of the power of this is actually kind of in aggregate saying, look, there's some weight behind this.
Those rider types were self-declared or?
Self-declared. The other thing that the map does is it creates a kind of authoritative reference. Right, so now people can go back and say, oh, there's this thing that was created, and because it was created through the technical means of using your smartphone, it gives us kind of authority that doesn't necessarily happen through some of the other kinds of public participation modes, or some of the other ways that planners generate data. I think the piece that's also really important to note here is that this starts to show some of the socioeconomic contours of the city, and certainly of at least the recruiting capacity for this project and the way that we in the city rolled it out. So this is downtown Atlanta, this is midtown, this is a pretty heavy residential area, solidly middle and upper middle class, right? Pretty dense. This is what's known as the historic west side of Atlanta. It's a number of distressed neighborhoods, and you can see that it's also very barren, right? And so it's a traditionally African-American kind of set of communities, same down in the south part of the city. And it's not that these places are not bikeable or that people don't bike there, but it's really that the kind of people who ride their bike to work and choose to record to ride their bike to work don't live there. And so as we think about this as a form of advocacy and that kind of participation in the process, this becomes really important, because now if this map becomes kind of the authoritative touchstone, then certain communities are being rendered completely out of that map, even as you could make arguments that for economic growth and connectivity to the city, they might be the ones that would be the largest beneficiaries of different kinds of cycling infrastructure. But that's also very complicated, and I'll come back to that thought. So now I want to kind of use this as a segue into this idea of participation through the data. All right, so the way these data get collected in this particular project and the kinds of the environment that the planners that were working with us created and the kinds of things that they were trying to do and bringing this in was that they weren't just looking at this and saying, oh, now we have these data. They were using this to refer to a population of people kind of almost as if they were in the room or in conversation with that process. So building on the talk from this afternoon in the design lab, here's another design charrette. Again, there's lots of paper, so you'll know there's some common things here. There's lots of paper on the table where people were talking about alternate design choices and implications for different kinds of street configurations. If you're not familiar with the design charrette, it's a practice in urban planning where you open a meeting up to the public and go through a process. It's meant to be a structured design process of kind of pitching and then revising design plans based on public input and feedback. This charrette happened to last 3 days, where the first 2 days were intense kind of all-day meetings around maps and tables, and then the third day was a full day of riding around the city so that planners and other stakeholders could actually see the physical constraints of different intersections and roads and proposed routes. In the background is an early version of that digital map that I showed you of our data. And at this point in time, we had not quite 600 people who had used the app and not quite 6,000 rides that had been recorded. Since then, it's a little over 2,000 people and I think 40 or 50,000 rides recorded. And our use has kind of tapered off because as the project kind of has come and gone in the public's mind, their desire to continue to participate in that way also comes and goes. What was important in this meeting was that as different alternatives were discussed, the data kept being brought in different ways. So I talked about it being a kind of authority. So in some sense, it was always looming over the meeting because they put it on the projector and left it on for 2 days while they were in the room. So someone could always turn around and gesture at it. And the fact that it was recorded by GPS, geolocation and phones, made it really important in the way that people said, oh no, we know that people went there, right? Other activities here had participants drawing on the map. Okay, this is my route to work. This is how I go, or this is how I would like to go. And those, of course, can be questioned as kinds of speculation or optimizations that people might do in the meeting, whereas the stuff that was on the map was because, in fact, someone did go there at some point in time to make that trace possible. But then at the same time, we would get kinds of questions where someone would say, well, this street, so on Peachtree, and Peachtree is a north-south boulevard, and it's very busy, and it's also very bike unfriendly. But there was one kind of section there that looked like someone had, or looked like possibly many people had been using it over the period of time leading up to this. And so at first, we had people say, well, this is great. Like, obviously, people are going up and down Peachtree. Let's think about putting bike infrastructure there. It's also one of the most contested boulevards in the city because businesses don't want to take away on-street parking. Car drivers don't want to give up lanes of traffic. And so there's been decades of argument over what to do with that street. Even though it looked busy, then what immediately happened is that someone said, well, what if it's just one person riding up and down and recording their rides? And I'm pretty sure that's what it was. You record your ride to and from work for a couple weeks, and suddenly you're the most important thing on that street. And so what I think is important here is this turn, though, is that, well, that activity made that person look very bright in the data. And so in a kind of smart cities data analytics mode, you might say, well, how do we normalize this? How do we build this into our understanding of the data so that no one person kind of sways our analysis? And that's perfectly true and perfectly valid as a way to approach it. But if we think about the digital democracy mode or the kind of messy participation mode, maybe that's more like the woman in the earlier picture who was standing up at the microphone, letting her voice be heard. And so if we want to think about participation, not just in, oh, you've done some labor for our meeting, but participation as a form of advocacy through data, then how we normalize and where we decide to draw those lines becomes an interesting and challenging question. And all of this kind of points to different ways and the different subjectivities of the data. So questioning around how it was produced, who produced it, when it was produced, and those conditions being very important to whether or not or how it was used in any given argument. And where objective measures of ground truth, I think, intentionally foreclose some of these alternate readings. By actually embracing the subjective here, we start to see that data can become a rhetorical perch for arguing for what you would like, kind of as a civic imaginary and through this planning process. So as we kind of move through this and think about infrastructures of participation, it also creates a set of productive tensions, right, around where data are produced and the ways that they are put to use, right, and who gets to put them to use. So in a separate, I would call this a design workshop because this was part of my professional practice and I don't do design charrettes, but in some ways a very similar kind of activity. We were out at a commuter breakfast, a cycling commuter breakfast, and talking with different cyclists to say, okay, well, we have these data. How can we then start to take them and put them to use within your advocacy community so that beyond just that kind of point in time charrette around that one particular development project, you can start to advocate for the kinds of resources and changes that you would like to see in the city. Right, and what some of this starts to surface is that there are some real temporal issues between when data is produced, when an issue might be resolved, and what that feedback loop looks like. Right, so some of that might be, oh, we need a pothole fixed, or that there's a stoplight that doesn't respond to a bike coming up to it. Others are bigger things like restriping or changing the configuration of a street so that it has a bike lane on it. And the time frame for when these things are addressed is large, right? So best case in Atlanta, a pothole will get fixed in maybe 7 to 10 days. I was told by planners in the city that just to restripe a street, so repainting the lines on a street, would take at least 4 to 6 months, and that's not repaving, right? So if we get into other kinds of projects that are more intensive, moving sidewalks or things like that, that puts the time frame further out. And so from a participation, from like kind of a civic participation and feedback loop mechanism, thinking through these temporal challenges is important. The other challenge, or the other kind of thing that we have to consider, is these cross-community identities and visibility within the data. So I showed the map and how physical communities are kind of rendered out of it, but there's also identities of who's a cyclist, right? And so people who identify as a cyclist with specialized gear and a willingness to lug stuff beyond themselves on their bike and go to and from work and get sweaty and gross in Atlanta, that takes a certain bar, right? And then there's a whole other category of people who, they don't identify as a cyclist, but maybe they ride 3 blocks to the bus station or to the train station, right? And so how do we think about those people in the data and through this participation and the way that they become visible and are able to be kind of counted for? And there's the issues of representation of race and class and particular connections to the environment of development in Atlanta, right? And so Atlanta has a long history of race and class, as you might imagine, and some of the areas that are undergoing redevelopment, that are facing challenges of displacement and gentrification, are largely African American. They're largely places that have struggled with economic difficulty for decades, right? And we can have a separate conversation about the history of some of those. But I think the challenge here is not just that they're not necessarily rendered in the data, but that issues of development and the kinds of conversations around what different kinds of streets level development might mean is different than, oh, this helps you move around the city, right? So in talking to neighborhood and community groups that are in the West Side, when they see bike lanes come into their neighborhood, the first thing they think is, oh, here comes the gentrification, right? So they see that as a very kind of, bourgeois activity, not something that's built for their community. And so that also, it's not just that they're not in the data, but that they don't want to be in some ways. And so non-participation becomes a kind of resistance, in some sense, because that's the only resistance that's left open to them. And I think understanding that dynamic is also something that is a challenge to the way that we think about digital civics, because the way that you might resist might look like something that it's not, or might not look like resistance. In the end, though, I think the most difficult thing for me anyway to get my head around, and maybe what I should have done at the beginning of this talk is talk about how I'm not actually going to give you any solutions, I'm just going to pose problems, because I don't have any of these solutions. But that public participation or civic participation in its kind of broadest sense has traditionally been thought of as some kind of face-to-face interaction, right? It is this collective thing that we do in different forms and in different ways. And that collective discourse is actually an important part of this, at least the civil part of civic action. And as we move to forms of digital participation, it goes from that public-facing, collective interaction to this individual transaction of data production where your phone is in your pocket or in your bag and completely invisible, right? And so for modes of activism and advocacy where things like in the cycling community, things like critical mass or other kinds of social rides are there to provide visibility of a community and then let that be a way to pose conversation, when those are the strategic modes of interacting with the city become digital and invisible, then the activists and the advocates need to think of new ways of making themselves visible again and creating new tactics that leverage that digital, but also provide visibility into their processes. So really the thing that I'm thinking through as a design researcher and thinking about digital civics is really what are the different infrastructures of participation that engage with these multiple tensions, right? There's the tension of kind of building out data for rational decision making and on one side, and the messiness of public participation and contention and agonism and kind of the way that power gets negotiated. On the other, the messiness or the tension of collective and visible action on one side versus the invisibility of small devices in our pockets on the other, right? And on the one hand, I think we can think of this as that data presumes an empirical and dispassionate basis, right, to make policy decisions, right? And this is very much part of the kind of public administration mode of going out into communities. So there's lots of kind of professional practice around, well, you hold charrettes or other kinds of community endeavors, and they're there to provide some rational basis for coming to a final decision. And on the other hand, there's modes of participation that are messy and really about the politics and the history of a place and of a neighborhood that are not about the rational decision making. And so how do we negotiate this intersection? And what I would say is that the subjectivities of data really start to enable some of that negotiation. So it's embracing that ends up giving us a way to serve both masters in some sense, where we can create infrastructures that import data and provide kind of means for structured analysis, but also provide a way for that analysis to be contested and challenged by groups or individuals that don't agree with the way that it gets deployed. And what I would propose more generally, and this is where I kind of think about a design agenda, is that design and design research in particular provide a way to negotiate this, of exploring the relations between different community groups and this idea of civics as a broad category of relations, rather than trying to obviate out through engineering the kinds of transactions that lead to uncontestable conclusions. Right, but within that, there's all these hairy challenges and difficult problems around access to participation, right? Who uses the data? How do they use it? What are the devices that produce the data? Right, there's challenges or difficulties around the representation and visibilities, the normative membership within different communities. So, are you a cyclist or are you not? And when do you actually count as something like that? There's also challenges around kind of accountability, right? So with the Cycle Atlanta project, we produced, the community produced all these data. My colleague, Carrie, was really the person who, when the city needed to understand what was going on, they phoned her up because she and her PhD students are the one that would build the models and run the analysis. None of that is really accessible to the community. And, we're always looking for funding to build tools for the community, but I think the idea here is that it doesn't come for free, right? And it requires a lot of professional experience and kind of technical sophistication to take the kind of the messy data that gets produced and then turn it around into a usable form that can be put out into the world. I mean, the other part and the other challenge is sustaining participation, right? And so as we've seen, kind of people using our app taper off after the initial kind of excitement and push, the reality is that, like participation with your time, where you have to choose to go to a meeting at 6 p.m. or go home and make dinner, or collapse on the couch, or continue to stay here and work because there's a deadline, choosing to use your phone even to do this kind of work means that you're not using some other thing, or you're not doing some other work with your phone. And so just because it's kind of embodied through a piece of technology doesn't mean that somehow it is multiply available in a way that doesn't have the same kinds of mundane trade-offs and attention and use that our own time has. The other part that I think is worth considering is that as we move towards more digital modes of participation, it implies a kind of professionalization around that, so that it's not just about showing up at the meeting and expressing your view, but being able to make a sophisticated case with data so that your argument is actually effective. And not everybody in a community knows how to do that, or will know how to do that, or will have the time or desire to do that. And so there's an appeal here to say, well, this intersection between smart cities and digital democracy really needs to think about kind of whose skills and what practices are being brought to bear at each of these different intersections. And for design, really thinking not about solutions per se, right, but different framings of problems, and understanding and taking on this idea of data as a kind of material that gets used in design, and what does it mean to think of data as a material, and kind of that gets manipulated through that process to produce change in the world. So I think I will stop there, looking at the clock, and open it up for questions and comments. Thank you.